Hello, welcome back for session 5 on parity of esteem in global theoretical and historical context. We have two distinguished speakers. The first of which is Simon Lee, who was a professor of jurisprudence here at Queen's University, Belfast from 1989 to 1995. After which he was made emeritus professor also at Queen's and left Northern Ireland to lead first Liverpool Hope University College for 8 years and then Leeds Metropolitan University for 6. He has written about law and ethics, religion, politics and sport. He was also executive director of the Cambridge Theological Federation and a fellow of St Edmund's College, Cambridge, before returning to being a professor of law at the Open University, which operates in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England. He was also the director of citizenship and governance research. He is now a professor of law at Aston University. When working in Northern Ireland at Queen's, he was a regular commentator in the media, and with Robin Wilson was the co-founder of Initiative 92, a civil society movement which established an inclusive dialogue open to submissions from all corners, with public hearings which led to the OPSAL report in 1993 and a further year of outreach running up to the ceasefires of 1994. Meanwhile, he served on the Standing Advisory Commission on Human Rights, where he wrote reports on abortion law reform and on parity of the age of consent, and on the new South and East Belfast Health and Social Services Trust Board. He has written and taught and studied parity of esteem for a long time, including an essay from 1994 on parity of esteem, a chapter in his book Uneasy Ethics in 2003, and a presentation to Stormont on parity of esteem revisited and reimagined in 2017. There are 3 more recent essays on this as well, dating from 2023 to 25, respectively. He has chaired various voluntary boards, including for professional theatres and a professional rugby club, and has been appointed to public roles by Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat politicians. He's currently the chair of the William Temple Foundation and has written recently about the origins of other concepts of related interest, such as the rule of law, the welfare state, serendipity and hope. He continues to write about the purposes of university and to write in celebration of diverse anniversaries in the history of ideas. He will be speaking to us today about wranglers of disparity, ? And he'll be followed by Anurag Deb, who is a practicing barrister. He read law at Queen's University and obtained a master's degree in human rights law in 2015, also at Queen's, and in 2019 was called to the Bar of England and Wales. After 6 years in legal practice, he returned to academia, is now also pursuing a part-time PhD, looking at the separation of powers and how to situate non-judicial perspective on constitutionalism within the UK constitutional framework. He will be speaking to us about parity of esteem, centrifugalism and centripetalism in governing Northern Ireland and India. Thank you so much. And over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody here, particularly the organisers. Tom especially has been very gracious since I questioned the way the call for papers was put, but I went through that repechage exercise. So the hierarchy of esteem that Tom and the organisers have is quite clear. There's Chris, way up at top, who got an hour yesterday, having explained that he's been thinking about this for 4 weeks. Then there's the organisers, the 4 organisers, the 12 speakers who were named, and then anybody else who wanted to lob in, of whom I was one. So I have about 5 minutes per decade of my work on this. And so I thought I would begin, to keep me to time to some extent, My title, as you've heard, is Wranglers of Disparity. And that's the first line of a poem I've composed in a Filipino form, the tanaga, in which you have 4 lines, 7 syllables each. So if you're bored with what I'm saying, you can work out how you would complete that poem, Wranglers of Disparity. And it's a sort of homage to the people I thought seemed rather against parity of esteem, such as some of the organizers of the conference and Chris and others. But it turns out we've just perhaps got different conceptions. So that's the broad aim. And there is a paper which I can give to Tom and could be circulated, but I've condensed it into 20 points. This is a sort of T20 approach in which I have, on average, a point per minute. So point number 1, I won't number them all. The Canada Room. It's a joy to have come to the Canada Room in this, you've heard that I like anniversaries. In this year, it's the 250th anniversary, as you probably all know, of the letter from George Washington to the inhabitants of Canada, suggesting that they become the 14th colony. The latest version turns that into the 51st state, but you can look that up. And the second thing I want to say is that I spoke in my hometown, where I now live, Olney, O-L-N-E-Y, in Buckinghamshire, near Milton Keynes, on a 250th anniversary recently. And the book of that is coming out, book of essays. My essay is it's on Amazing Grace, which was written 250 years ago in Olney by Reverend John Newton. And the organizers, the Open University and the Cooper and Newton Museum in Olney, they just lost confidence in the day before and said, I'm not sure we can sing the 4th line of the first verse. So, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. They said it's going to offend visually impaired people. And I said, well, don't think it is, but do you want to ask some visually impaired people? And they said, we don't know any visually impaired people. And drawing on my experience of being in Northern Ireland, I said, I think the thing to do is an inclusive dialogue here. Let's ask some people who are visually impaired. I know a whole school for the visually impaired in Liverpool, St. Vincent's. And at no notice, they went into their chapel, sang the first verse. I mean, they were free to do whatever they wanted, and then gave us a video message which said that they didn't mind that line. And they said, because we know that we at St. Vincent's have the real vision, which was a highlight of an otherwise tedious conference, which is being turned into a book. And my essay was on 250 years of lawyers talking about Amazing Grace, which eventually gets to President Obama doing it rather well. Anyway, the third thing I want to say is that, follows from that for me, parity of esteem isn't like it is for Christopher McCrudden and others. I'm not really that bothered whether it's a legal principle or a constitutional principle. I think it's a way of being or striving to be or trying to become in the way in which you relate to other people. And in particular, you could use different words, and I'm not hung up on the exact words appearing. But another word that might feature sometimes is mutual, and I like the word reciprocal. And by the time you get to reciprocity of esteem or reciprocal esteem, it's very different from how it's used in this context. But it's a favorite phrase, actually, of George Washington, who wrote letters to all kinds of people all the time. And he wrote a side letter, this is September 1775, to the general serving him in Canada, and said, whatever you do, make sure that the soldiers respect the different religious traditions of Canadians. We're not going in there to try and take them over. We're trying to respect their different religion. By which he meant that the Americans were Protestants and the Canadians were Catholics, a point famously forgotten by many Irish Americans over 250 years. But it was a principle of his. And the reason why I'm out to point 4, I regard this also as the 50th anniversary year of David Blakely and Oliver Napier using the phrase parity of esteem in the Constitutional Convention. It's not just randomly that I decided to say it. It was because after publication of the Uppsala report, I have got some visual aids here, i.e. books, which I could pull it out. Reg MP, who later rose to be Sir Reg MP, Lord MP, he said it was a nationalist plot from a nationalist forum. And I was saying, no, it wasn't. It was raised by small U unionists. And you've heard what the background to it was. 1975 is also the year in which I was interviewed for university. So this is the 50th anniversary of that. I was interviewed by a number of philosophers, Joseph Raz, Alan Montefiore, a number. And one of the sets of interviews, we'd had to write a general essay paper, and they said, did you think the general essay paper was fair? Which was a kind of trick question, I thought. So I said, yes, it was. So they said, well, then in that case, you should be able to answer some questions you didn't answer on the day in the exam, which I didn't think followed at all. But I mean, they were logicians. So I went with it. And they chose 2 questions I hadn't answered. One was on the relationship between law and morality, which led to my first book, which is called Law and Morals. The other was, what are universities for? Oxford in those days had a habit of questions leaving you hanging. What are universities for on the general paper? The last question on my jurisprudence paper was, what is a legal system a system of? But what are universities for? I said, the pursuit of truth, and they kind of groaned. By this stage, there are loads of them there. But I think that it kind of holds, and I'll come back to that. So 1976 is going to be a big year for me because it's the 50th anniversary of going up to university and beginning to study law. And I was taught law in the first year, 3 subjects. I was taught by 3 astonishing people. This is in small group tutorials with 2 students and the tutor for an hour of torture, some said. It turned out later that they weren't experts in those particular subjects or our particular jurisdiction. So we had a Welsh labour lawyer for Roman law, which has proved very useful over the years. We had an Israeli philosopher on constitutional law, and we had Christopher McCrudden on criminal law, who, as you can see, is only a year or 2 older than the cohort he was teaching. And in our first tutorial, I was paired with a student called Timothy Brennan, who survived this ordeal to become a KC, but sadly died last year. And I presume because Brennan comes before Lee, Chris asked him to read out his essay, or rather to start reading out his essay. And as you saw yesterday, Chris can ask some really tough questions. I hope he's not going to do so today. And also had this ability to be very animated, a lot of shaking of the head, or at least there were in our tutorials. There might have been some nodding in some other ones. And as the hour proceeded, he taught me a lot, and I think Tim, about how to read cases, what we should have been looking for. He said, you need to know the facts, the issue, the decision, the reasons for the decision. That's a starter. And I tried to join in once or twice. And again, if I can demonstrate the gestures, Chris would say, no, let him answer. And that was a great lesson for academic life, as everybody in the room will know, because you can get a long way by pretending that you know the answer and are tempted to intervene if you know that the chair or the tutor or the chair of the meeting, whatever, is going to say no, let the other person struggle. So we learned a lot, but but I learned to have a kind of love of what I thought was the ethos, since that term was hated yesterday, the ethos of Balliol. And I've been writing about it ever since. And in particular, I was interested in why did William Temple and William Beveridge, who were at Balliol at the turn of the century with R.H. Tawney, why did they get involved in the founding of the welfare state? It was the 80th anniversary of the Beveridge Report 3 years ago, and we had a seminar back in Balliol on this. And I brought the Balliol ethos down to two things that Beveridge had said. Caird, the master, when they were leaving, had said to them, your challenge now, with so much wealth in our country, is to find out why there is so much poverty and to do something about it. And going back 10 or 20 years before that, Anthony Hope Hawkins, who wrote Prisoner of Zenda as Anthony Hope, he said that his tutor, Nettleship, taught everybody to search for the truth. So, I mean, I was right after all in that interview, to search for the truth, but never to be sure you found it. And Dicey said something similar about Jowett, his tutor in classics, and later famous master. Dicey was at Balliol as well. And the three people most often talked about on the rule of law were all at Balliol in various ways. Dicey, Bingham, student there, and Raz, who's a tutor there. And so on and so forth. Charles Taylor was mentioned yesterday, who has the distinction of being Canadian and a Balliol alumnus. So I've been interested in why do some institutions have a particular ethos or character? Is it carried on or is it lost? And Chris helped me through at least the first 10 years of my career in various other ways. And he wrote something on the changing constitution, in which I thought he said that whether something is constitutional or not depends on the political instability. So that in an unstable society such as Northern Ireland, almost everything is constitutional. I still hold to that, even if other people want to jettison the health, education, languages stuff. I think that's a great insight. But I moved on, well, next door, after a bit of an interlude, and I was teaching, my first year of teaching in 1981, and on my first day, the head of the college, Anthony Quinton, said, he knew who I was because he'd interviewed me, Simon Lee, how is your ankle? I had no idea what he meant, and he had such a clipped accent. I wasn't really sure that he said ankle. It could have been uncle in the way he pronounced things, but it was ankle. And somebody else explained to me that what he meant was, there's a poem by William Wordsworth about old Simon Lee, the huntsman, who had weak ankles through all the years of working as a woodcutter. So I thought, I better read some Anthony Quinton, because this is going to be difficult, hanging around with these guys. And the thing I particularly liked was one of his essays on the Richthofen sisters, in which he said, Anthony Quinton, this is, there are two kinds of people. Those who think there are only two kinds of people, and the rest. And I'm very much with the rest. So for me, an issue around parity of esteem is, first of all, if we're going to take it forward, not necessarily as a constitutional or legal principle, but into life, I think we need to work on reciprocity across traditions or diverse lifestyles, as well as worrying about the state, whichever state it might be, and its attitude to us. But I also think it's important that we respect people and how they want to be described in their tradition or identity, if you want to call it that. So, for instance, Sinn Féin has been very pro fluidity, non-binary approach to trans rights. And if that approach could be taken into issues around whether or not you have an aspiration on identity or of a national nature at all, that would be a very interesting world. And in particular, I don't think it's appropriate in the non-binary fluid world to designate anybody as other. I get designated as other sometimes. When you're filling in one of those forms and it has Ms., Mr., Doctor, all sorts of things, Lords, whatever. If it doesn't have Professor, there is a box of Other. And at some point I must have ticked that in an NHS form. And so you get referred to quite a bit as Other. And that's like being a Muslim or perhaps a Green Party member or an independent member or an alliance member or a Chinese, Northern Irish person here. So maybe we can talk about that later on. But anyway, one way or another, I clung to this tripartite parity of esteem ideal from secondary education in the 1940s, the idea that secondary and technical education should be the equivalent of grammar schools, never realized in practice, and tried to take it into other things. And no sooner had I arrived here, as you heard, in 1989, than I went to the USSR, because I was already committed to going, on a public law expedition, mostly people from UCL, Dawn Oliver and co really organizing it. But the leader was Professor Wade. Unfortunately, I'd written a critical review of Wade's 5th edition, in which I said, judges like Wade, Wade likes judges, and pointed out that, well, anyway, a number of things, but he wasn't very happy. But anyway, when I was introduced as being from Belfast, although I'd only just arrived, all the questions were directed at me. And in particular, we had a week in Moscow and a week in Ashgabat. And the question in Ashgabat was, is the problem in Northern Ireland like the problem here in the Turkmen Republic, now Turkmenistan? I said, well, I don't really know what the problem is in either place, but you tell me what your problem is. And they said, well, it's the Muslim villagers who want to keep the dowry system and the state who wants to suppress it. And that was their impression, which may or may not be accurate, depending on your point of view, of what was going on here in Northern Ireland. But I asked 2 questions, and the translators said that they couldn't translate either of them, not because of linguistic deficiencies, but because they would lose their jobs. One was, would Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, be published in the USSR? This is only just before it collapsed. And the other was, how is the right of secession, which each republic has in what I would call parity of esteem constitutional model, how does it work in practice? Can't talk about that. So we move on, and I get to a book that you know about, but probably wouldn't dignify by reading, which is Hillbilly Elegy, on the grounds that Chris and I and a number of other people also went to Yale Law School. This is by J.D. Vance. And if you haven't read it, it's important to get as far as page 3, in which he says, I may be white, but I don't identify with the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the Northeast. I identify with the millions of working-class white Americans of Scots-Irish descent who have no college degree. The Scots-Irish are one of the most distinctive subgroups in America. They have many good traits, an intense sense of loyalty, a fierce dedication to family and country, but also many bad ones. We do not like outsiders or people who are different from us, whether the difference lies in how they look, act, or talk. To understand me, you must understand that I am a Scots-Irish hillbilly at heart. Well, now we know. So it comes back to here rather like Canada 250 years ago. And I could go on about Initiative 92, process of inclusive dialogue, from which parity of esteem got, I think, a boost. But my point isn't about whether you take that doctrine and who coined it and so on. It's more that the process was one which showed or modeled parity of esteem. And I've tried to take that into other things I've done, and in particular, into running universities. And I've applied a lesson that I got from Marianne Elliott, one of the Opsal commissioners, in her book on the Catholics of Ulster, in which the last chapter is called A Resentful Belonging. And when I asked her why, she said, because of John Dunlop's book, which was called A Precarious Belonging. I know that I'm almost out of time. And resentful belonging and precarious belonging explain a lot of things, including the Brexit referendum, some of the difficulties in Northern Ireland, but especially university life, where everybody is resentful. Many people are precarious. Many people are precarious and resentful, and where, if you're running a university, you soon learn that what people will resent the most is taking away the justifications for being resentful. So I could point to, if we had time, or maybe an answer to the questions, various essays which I think need to be considered in this kind of group, or however you take it forward. One is Australian, we'd now say Indigenous leaders, but the person himself said Aborigine leader, talking on the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, which was won, and wrote about parity of esteem, and said that was what he thought it was about back in 1967. And I want to come towards the end by referring to an Irish ethnomusicologist, Michael O'Sullivan, and his essay on parity of esteem in his life and work. And I haven't heard people in the room give their Irish translations of parity of esteem, but he says it's Cotram na féine, and that really means fair play. And it'd be quite interesting to work out, is there a different way of looking at it, or what does it really mean? But he said that his life's work was to try and integrate traditional or folk or Irish music into the classical canon and vice versa, and to give them parity of esteem in universities and in life. And I think that's really what we're trying to do in various ways in Northern Ireland and beyond. It's not a question of is it or isn't it in a particular section of a particular treaty. So to conclude, the most difficult thing running a university that was a teacher training set of institutions or a polytechnic is people in more prestigious universities who don't want to be associated with people who are actually widening participation. And if we can learn to respect reciprocally the different kinds of universities and what they're for, I think that would be a better sector. And trying to do that in various ways has been a challenge. So I'm happy to talk about any of that if we have appropriate questions, but my final observation, this is my 20th point, is that since nobody clearly has been reading any of my stuff over 4 decades or followed any of the things I've been doing to try and apply it, I'm branching out and I'm writing a political satire called Remote Control, because next year is as you know, the 300th anniversary of Swift's Gulliver's Travels, and 2029 will be the 300th anniversary of Modest Proposal. And in Remote Control, I imagine that when Kennedy said we're going to send somebody to the moon, it was a cover story for underground NASA having a kind of remote control headquarters for an experiment in how to stop a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis by finding somewhere in the world to have all the terrible policies you could imagine and work out what happens. And they chose Northern Ireland. And then it kind of unravels. They decide it's going to take 5 years to set up, 25 years to run, 5 years to run down. This explains the timeline of the Troubles. Irene Harper at the back there was here at Queen's in the mid-60s. In fact, the last time I was in Northern Ireland, everybody, bar me, had been here, meetings about people's democracy. And it's worked out by people who are trying to bring the Olympics to Belfast, which is a sort of variation on the Manchester bid. And I hope that you'll see yourselves in some of the characters in that, or at least the archetypes or stereotypes. But I think one way or another, it's a good idea to keep challenging ourselves and to keep applying, despite what some other people have said, keep applying it in these areas such as mental health, where David Cameron said it was a great achievement, but it wasn't in the statute, but it eventually has come into practice and has been a thoroughly good thing, I think. So, thank you very much for your tolerance, particularly to the chair and to Anurag, and I'll come back if there are any questions. Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, I'm not a practicing barrister, just in case somebody from the Bar Standards Board grapples through one of these ornate windows and kills me for passing off as one. But I am called to the bar, that's all. So I'm going to be talking about Parity of Esteem, centrifugalism, and centripetalism in governing Northern Ireland and India. The analogy is specifically to late colonial India between 1937 and 1946. The comparison points are many. The polities, some even surprised me in terms of how apt the comparison would be. So it is vast, and I am not at all making the claim that this is comprehensive. I'm just looking at, in the context of Parity of Esteem, the relationship or directionality of relationship between two dominant communities and the polity in which they are situated. So in my analysis, one direction is towards an established center of authority or center of power, which is the centripetal direction, and the other is the other way. So the centrifugal direction is away from the center of power. And I'll get into applying that model to both jurisdictions. So in outline, I'm defining Parity of Esteem pretty broadly. It's not really a definition per se. It's a way of kind of thinking about it beyond the Good Friday Agreement and beyond the history of Northern Ireland as a devolved jurisdiction. And by history, I'm going all the way back to 1920, actually beyond that. In the paper, I'll cover sort of the start of the Irish Home Rule movement and indeed the start of the Union itself. A paper which, in true academic fashion, I haven't started writing. But, I will at some point. So centripetal, centrifugal narratives are crucial narrative concerns here. Majoritarian politics or a majoritarian community favors a centripetal direction towards a metropole. And the minoritarian interest would favor, conversely, a centrifugal direction away from the metropole or towards a different metropole. Northern Ireland went through this conflict from its birth in the 1920s. There were a lot of underlying centripetal governance changes, particularly in the franchise and in the amount of control that local authorities had over matters like housing and healthcare. British India also experienced this, and in particular reached its apex in 1946 with the Cabinet Mission Plan, which I'll go into in detail as well. And the reason I'm trying to go into these narratives is because Parity of Esteem as a concept, as we heard yesterday, has reared its head again in a very serious way after Brexit. And it increasingly forms a part of political discourse. And what I want to look at is how to navigate the sort of post-Brexit reality of Parity of Esteem, particularly in the context of the Windsor Framework, and also have some ideas about what it might look like in a united Ireland. So a comparison, I keep doing this, sorry. A comparison of colonial political theology. This is a term taken from a paper looking specifically at British India. Northern Ireland, 1921 to 72, you had still have, of course, two dominant communities, a fragmented franchise restricted highly by property ownership, and the payment of council tax, which disenfranchised a lot of nationalists and a lot of working class people at the time. Two conceptions of governance. Centripetalism, which was Stormont moving closer and closer to the metropole, which in this conception really is London, Westminster, Whitehall. And nationalism moving away from the metropole. And this sort of would be the culmination of the original Irish Home Rule movement in order to have a united Ireland away from the empire, the metropole altogether. Each conception was also, underlined by a fight for specific rights and conceptions of cultural identity, including language and religion. But you see the same sorts of considerations in British India as well. The rise of two dominant communities, Hindus and Muslims, an extremely fragmented franchise, which was restricted by property ownership. For reference, the 1931 census of British India had 350 million people, and the number of eligible voters in 1934 were less than 1.5 million. Very fragmented on the basis of religion. Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims had separate electorates. Also on the basis of caste. The so-called depressed classes, which in modern India, they're known as scheduled castes or Dalits, were a separate electorate by themselves. Again, two conceptions of governance, centripetalism towards a dominant center. This was particularly in the idea of India envisioned by the Congress Party, and dominant caste Hindus. And by dominant caste, I don't mean dominant in a demographic sense, because the so-called depressed classes were in fact numerically much greater. I mean dominant in a privileged sense, in a politically powerful sense. Caste doesn't care about number, it cares about lineage and privilege. And centrifugalism towards strong regional entities and strong subnational entities, particularly in the vision of the Muslim League. And each conception of governance, again, had its corresponding conception of rights. And again, we come to language and religion. Language in particular, there was an overall lingua franca of India in the 19th century, which still today is known as Hindustani. But in the mid to late 19th century, it's split into two registers. What became Hindi, which was heavily Sanskritized and became the Hindu language, and what became Urdu, which was heavily inflected with Persian and Arabic words and became the Muslim language. These are not liturgical languages. The Hindu liturgical language is Sanskrit, the Muslim liturgical language is Arabic, but these were languages indissociable from their religious, political communities. And there's a great debate in the Indian Constituent Assembly debates about which language should be the national language of modern India. Even though the Congress envisioned a secular modern India, they eventually settled on Hindi, which says something, I think. And the four pictures at the bottom, on the left, you have Joseph Devlin, MP, leader of the Nationalist Party in Northern Ireland in the 20s, and of course, his counterpart is opposite in some ways, James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. And in British India, you have Muhammad Ali Jinnah on the left, the eventual Governor-General of Pakistan, known as the father of the nation, and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru on the right, the first Prime Minister of independent India. I'm going to skip over these slides because they basically go into details about what I was explaining about Northern Ireland between 21 and 72, and I want to keep to time as much as possible. So here we come to the sort of origin of the concept of parity of esteem, even though it wasn't called that in British India in the late 30s and 40s. In 1935, there was a new constitutional settlement enacted by the UK Parliament, the Government of India Act 1935. It envisioned an Indian federation and very strong provinces. There were 11 provinces which had competence over almost every subject, bar a few that were under the direct control of the British-appointed governors. At the federal level, you had a three-chamber legislature, a lower house which was elected, an upper house which was largely nominated or indirectly elected, and a third chamber of princely states, which were the sort of monarchies and directly ruled states within India, which were not part of British India, but owed allegiance to the crown. Now, in this political space, there emerged two dominant parties. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, originally committed to greater self-government and then progressively towards complete independence. Officially committed to secular politics, but drawn largely from dominant caste Hindus. They had some Muslim leaders, but they were few and far between. Two major wings, one perceived to be more moderate, favoring continuing ties with the UK, the other favoring complete severance of those ties. By the time we come to the period I'm interested in, which is the late 30s, early 40s, the Congress had also had leaned very strongly towards envisioning a socialist, central, independent Indian republic. The Muslim League, founded in 1906 in Dhaka, present-day Bangladesh, originally an organization which campaigned on behalf of the landed Muslim classes. This remained a refrain for the League's politics throughout its existence, even to the present day. But it eventually grew to claim to speak on behalf of every Muslim in British India, particularly in the 40s. And we'll see why in a second. So the provincial elections in 1937, you see the sort of light blue shading represents the Congress-controlled provinces. The dark blue is the Unionist Party, which is basically the same underlying objective as the official Unionist Party here, close links with the UK, do not end direct British rule, keep going, that sort of thing. And the United Party in Sindh, which was sort of a non-sectarian party. But what you do not see here is the Muslim League. They did not gain a single majority in any province in 1937. Now, partly, there were some attempts to form Congress and League coalitions, but these disintegrated because neither party trusted one another. The Congress refused to recognize the League as the official voice of Indian Muslims because the Congress too had Indian Muslims in its leadership. And also there were ideological differences in terms of the Congress turning more towards left-wing politics in the 30s and the League maintaining its sort of landed capitalist roots. So in the end, coalition proved impossible. But then we get to 1946, which was the first provincial elections after the Second World War. What happened during the Second World War was all of the Congress ministries resigned because the British Indian authorities had declared war on the Axis powers on behalf of British India without consulting any of the provincial authorities. So the Congress ministries resigned en masse, the League remained, and therefore grew more trusted by British Indian authorities. So, attempts to form a federal government never happened. There was too much underlying tension between the Congress and the League, but also, and here's where the sort of centripetal-centrifugal narrative comes in, particularly. If you look at the incredibly fragmented franchise, so in the House of 250 seats in the lower house, the House of Assembly, 105 would be general, open to anyone, 82 would be Muslim, 19 would be Sikh. It would be impossible on a sectarian level to gain a majority in that house, and thus form the government. And politics in India at this point had become so sectarianized that you couldn't conceive of a party winning general and any other category. So, the Congress wouldn't have a majority, neither would the League. What would be the point in this federation anyway? Nobody wanted it. And so there was a deep sectarian distrust, a deep ideological distrust between the Congress and the League at this time. And eventually this led in 1940 to the Lahore Resolution and growing demands for separate Muslim Indian state or states. Fast forward to 1946, and you see the League winning 3 provinces, Punjab, Sindh, Bengal, all 3 of which would go on to form Pakistan in 1947. And the blue shading formed the Dominion of India in 1947. And so this entrenched the legitimacy of the League as the spokes party for Muslims in India. No longer could it and its political aspirations be ignored. Now, this, the last-ditch attempt to keep India united, the Cabinet Mission Plan, this is an extract from the plan itself, and I've highlighted a couple of things which, point number 2 especially, should be familiar to anyone who has read the Northern Ireland Act. Any question raising a major communal issue in the legislature should require for its decision a majority of the representatives present and voting of each of the 2 communities, as well as a majority of the members present and voting. Parallel majority consent. This is not to say that the Cabinet Mission Plan inspired the Good Friday Agreement. I'm not making that claim. That would be, in my head anyway, far-fetched. But what it does anchor is the fact that the 2 polities show some remarkable similarities in terms of the ideas to maintain unity but have 2 conflicting communities effectively come to the table and govern. But this is an inherently centrifugal plan because it is a true federation. In other words, all the residual powers would go to the provinces. The provinces would be able to form groups of provinces. They could exit those groups voluntarily if they wanted, or form new groups as they pleased at every 10-yearly intervals. And it was the provinces, their desire for federation, that would ensure the survivability or otherwise of the federation itself. An inherently centrifugal plan, because this is what the architecture looks like, okay? And the direction of the arrows going from the provinces to the federation is effectively the direction of power that the plan envisioned. Inherently centrifugal. It is the anchor point is the provinces and their groups. The federation would not be able to survive without them. And this, in the tradition of Leia's wonderful maps, this is what it would have looked like. This is actually made by, it's sort of an alternate timeline kind of thing on a Reddit thread I discovered, which I thought was nice. I can't attribute it properly because the original, the person who made this deleted their Reddit account, so anyway. So the red center is Group A provinces, what eventually became India. And then on the two wings, you see the two shades of green, would be the Muslim parts, or the Muslim groups of provinces of British India, or of the Indian Federation. Obviously, this never happened. Now, why did the cabinet mission fail? Ostensibly because the Congress rejected it. And the rejection was extremely quick. The plan was published in May 1946, and then it was rejected in July of the same year. The League said yes, contingent on the Congress saying yes, and when the Congress said no, it collapsed. But I want to sort of present this kind of iceberg way of looking at the reasons why it failed, because there are deeper underlying reasons. It wasn't just Nehru getting up and saying, no, we can't accept this. Why did he say no? Yes, there were sectarian tensions, past Congress League tensions in terms of working together and political differences, but also because the plan was inherently centrifugal. It didn't balance centrifugalism and centripetalism. The Congress wanted a strong center, the League wanted strong provinces. The plan favored the League much more than the Congress. And so there was no effective balance between the two. This is sort of the crux of what I'm saying in this presentation, which is you cannot use a centrifugal plan or framework to realize a centripetal wish. You cannot use a centripetal framework to realize a centrifugal wish. You have to balance the two or give up altogether. Why is this relevant to Northern Ireland? The centrifugal-centripetal narrative has reemerged, and I think it's useful to look at Parity of Esteem in this term because since Brexit, new sort of divisions have appeared between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And so the anti-Windsor Framework movement, a lot of it is, frankly, silly, but there is a kernel of political aspiration, obviously, involved in it. Unionism wants to move closer and closer to the metropole and thus dissolve the Windsor Framework altogether, whereas the pro-Windsor Framework faction, which includes but is not limited to nationalism, is pretty happy with Northern Ireland being a place apart. And Northern Ireland being a place apart within the UK, even though it's a common refrain in a lot of UK constitutional law scholarship, just ask Martin Loughlin, it is not necessarily something that unionism wants. So the problem of trying to balance narratives comes back. What we had prior to Brexit in the Good Friday Agreement, pre-sort of 2016, was three interlocking strands. We still have those strands, but three interlocking strands, devolution in the east-west and the north-south axis. That does represent a sort of balance between the two opposing narratives. But Brexit then disrupted that narrative, or that balance, by creating a border between the two polities. Now, I think, therefore, it's interesting, or it's useful to look at the pro and anti-Windsor Framework movements in light of this, in light of the directionality of the relationship between communities and polities. Which center of power do they tend towards? Which center of power do they turn away from? And also, relevance in a united Ireland. In a united Ireland, the position would reverse. What is a centrifugal decision to unite with Ireland? It's centrifugal from the perspective of the current union, but it's centripetal from the perspective of Dublin. So it moves towards a new center of power. But within a united Ireland, if you were to accommodate unionism, you have to respect their centrifugal aspirations. In other words, they wouldn't want to completely subsume, or if they don't want to completely subsume. And so from nationalism being a centrifugal force, you have unionism as a centrifugal force. And so again, we come back to this question of balance through parity of esteem and what it actually requires. So in my analysis, I do not think that devolution is transitional or contingent, so long as Northern Ireland remains within British sovereignty. I think devolution is permanent, and it should be, not just because the Good Friday Agreement isn't contingent on which government has sovereignty over Northern Ireland, and yet the three strands continue, but also more sort of underlying analyses of the sort of direction of the direction of the relationship between communities and polities. You have to continue balancing centrifugal and centripetal tendencies. So I don't think, for example, unionist quotas in Dublin would help matters, because what you would effectively be doing in my sort of framework is you would be taking a centripetal framework, United Ireland, no regional distinctions, to guarantee centrifugal wishes of unionists, and it wouldn't work. In the same way that the Cabinet Mission Plan didn't work, albeit it was a reverse. So that is my thesis. And I look forward to any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you both so much. I see questions on the left first. Deviani and then Ewan.
I did have questions for Simon on belonging, but I first have a pressing question for Anurag, which is about what happened to the Unionist Party between the 36 picture that we saw of them winning over Punjab and the next, where they don't seem to be anywhere at all in the map. Did they just get subsumed by Muslim League, or what happened to them in the historic context?
Should I answer, or do you want to take a few questions?
It's so pressing, I think you should.
So yeah, they effectively collapsed. I mean, the Unionist Party was nominally non-sectarian, but it was also very exclusionary in the sense that it was effectively a non-sectarian version of the Muslim League. It was concerned with landowners and aristocrats. And even though they did relatively well in provincial government during the war, after the war, the votes just didn't go in their favor. So they just effectively fizzled out of political life in British India, and indeed beyond. So the Unionist Party effectively ceased to exist.
Just because of the position of the mic. You said you had a question for Simon as well? I can go wherever. Okay, that's good. So then Ewan, and then Viviane again. And I'm going to ask everyone else to raise their hands again after we've collected these two questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks. My question draws on something that Anurag said, but it's for both speakers. Anurag, you told us that the metropole's London, and in fact, probably Whitehall. And I'm not quite sure about that. Now, yesterday, Chris asked a treacherous question about the status of Northern Ireland as a settler colony. The reason the question is treacherous is not because the plantation of Ulster didn't happen, it's because there's a false equivalence that one can draw between the sort of colony that existed in, say, the Western Cape and the status of Northern Ireland. I'm not going to go there. My question is, I think what's distinctive about the United Kingdom is that our metropole includes a state like not just Northern Ireland, but Ireland before partition. And I don't think, so far as I understand it, the Unionists in Northern Ireland think they're inseparably connected to the mother country, the metropole. They think they're in the mother country. They think Britain's a union. And so I wonder whether what's distinctive about the framework that we have is that our metropole embraces a country that has the history and the legacy that Ireland has. And that's distinctive in respect of, say, France or Rome or other imperial models. And I think it has implications to the way that we think about union. Would you agree?
Deviani's next.
Yes, so coming to the question for Simon was, because you mentioned belonging and precarious belonging and the other kind of belonging. So yesterday we had some debates about, whether parity of esteem is just equality or is it equality plus something and what it's doing with the other words. So I wondered about your view on, do you see it as equality plus or just equality, or does it do something for belonging in addition as well?
Great, thank you. Simon, do you want to take your questions first? Anurag started, so.
Thank you, Devyani. Perhaps I can put it this way. I think it's possible to esteem somebody else's culture more than your own, which doesn't seem to be widely accepted, but I'll give an example. I don't know if you've ever seen the film or read the book Lone Survivor. Marcus Luttrell, a US Navy SEAL, like a SAS person, parachuted into Afghanistan to hunt down some Taliban leader, and 4 of them are found by some teenage boys, goat herds, and they decide whether to kill the boys or not. They decide not to. The boys explain what they've seen, and 3 of the Navy SEALs get killed. So Marcus Luttrell is left on his own. I mean, he gives a very heroic version of his own story. Who knows what the complete truth is? But ultimately, he is saved and rescued by the villagers, who are Pashtuns. And I use this quite a lot in Aston University, where I now teach in Birmingham, where we have 400 students on the public law module. 75% self-identify as British Muslims. And quite a few are Pashtuns. And a great colleague, Shade Parveen, is a trustee of the Pashtun Trust in Birmingham, which has both Pakistani and Afghan Pashtun people, or people with that heritage. And they say that their values are hospitality, integrity, a care for the oppressed. And in the story, true story, the villagers say it's our duty as Pashtuns to protect our guest, our visitor, even to the point of our death, which is what happens, and exile. So they protect the American. And in everyday life in Birmingham, that Pashtun Trust does a fantastic job. You've probably seen in the papers that council's kind of collapsed financially, the bins aren't being collected, but you can rely on Shade Parveen in the law school and the Pashtun Trust to go way beyond. And that sense of belonging is very, very strong, much stronger than any way in which you could describe my identity. Balliol and Yale think that my identity is caught up with them to such an extent that I'd want to give 2 of the richest institutions in the world my widow's mite, which I don't. There are so many more deserving higher education institutions and other charities. So I think it's a very important point which is missed out. And how much you have a sense of belonging is not just, as per J.D. Vance or some others, about how miserable your misery memoir can be, or how it puts you in a particular place politically. It's not just that, but it's also how good the tradition is and how much the tradition tries to improve itself in various ways. So take that into different parts of the university sector. Some people in this institution perhaps get a buzz out of Queen's after my time, describing itself as a Russell Group university. Having lost the battle on trying to stop colleges and polytechnics getting the university title, they try to think of their own term. I point out to them that the Russell Hotel is now called the Kimpton Fitzroy Hotel, and perhaps they should call themselves that. But some people get a kick out of it, but many people think it's a bit tawdry, really. And same thing over gay marriage, and can we find some way of distancing ourselves if that becomes the law, and so on and so forth. Same kind of arguments are used. It's not real marriage, or it's not a real university, whatever it might be. So I think belonging is obviously very, very complex, but I think it's very useful for my students who at the moment are preoccupied with events in the Middle East. And I began by teasing them about if they chant in a demonstration which could threaten their future legal careers, from the river to the sea, do they know which river and which sea? And they by and large do. But I then developed a follow-up question, which was, have you ever seen or been to a river or the sea? And almost none have been to the sea in real life, because they're living in Birmingham, coming as far as Aston, which is about a mile away from where they live. And Birmingham, for those who don't know, is landlocked, and also doesn't have rivers that you can see. It has some culverts and canals. And the only two rivers that the whole class of 400 people could say that they'd been to were, some had been to the Avon on a school trip for Shakespeare, and some had been to the Thames for a school trip to Parliament. And the point there is that it's not their fault, or it's not necessarily better to have been traveling around the world, but their experience is very, very limited. You could take Sandy Row or somewhere here and say, again, it's not the fault of those people. It's a very different experience from some other ones. And the sense of belonging, in one sense, becomes very intense for them, because that's what they've got to hold on to. But in another sense, if you can in class say, so we took the Australian voice referendum and the Irish care referendums in successive years. So which way do you think they're going to go? They all got them wrong. When we said we have a course on the future of law, what did they think of Nicola Sturgeon resigning in the middle of our course? They said, who is Nicola Sturgeon? Which is understandable. If I'd said, what about the person who wanted the trans prisoner to go into the women's prison, they might have got that out of the social media feed. So in their sense of what is important, what is belonging, they're fascinating. I'm trying to learn from the students, but they've got some things which are so way above my sense of belonging that it's very, very humbling. And some things where they need to kind of loosen up a little bit on understanding why other people get offended by things and so on and so forth. So I haven't got a crisp or clear answer, but I'm fascinated by the question. Look forward to discussing it further.
Great. Anurag, do you want to take Ewan's question?
Yes, thank you for the question, Ewan. I've actually, Metropole, as I was timing this presentation for the first time at 1 o'clock in the morning, the word came into my head and I used it. But you're absolutely right. It's not actually London. In fact, I've used metropole, and I've used the word metropole to signify the whole of the UK in another paper. So at the risk of contradicting myself, I agree with you. I think what is interesting, though, is looking at, shortly after the birth of the polity and when the Northern Parliament said yes to partition, there was a great zeal to, because the Government of Ireland Act had a different franchise for Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And of course, Southern Ireland never came to be. And there was a great zeal to try and match the systems in GB. And so instead of saying moving closer to the metropole, I think what I'm going to say is there was a more kind of desire for uniformity and a sort of erasure of distinction and context, which you saw in the changes to the local authority franchise in the 20s and the changes to the Stormont franchise in the 20s. So yes, in that sense, yes, obviously the interest is remaining within the metropole. But yes, in short, I do agree with you, yes. Thank you for the question.
Great. I know we have, Chris has a question. Are there others? I would like to collect them if so.
Thank you. This is not a treacherous question, I think. One of the recurring terms that's been used in yesterday and today that we haven't really sort of dusted off, that's connected to parity of esteem, and that's the term respect. And Simon has used it quite a lot. By the way, thank you for your talk, Simon. I'm not sure you got to 20 in your list, but maybe we could talk about the rest later on. So you were very careful in not describing it as a legal principle. You were describing it in the context of sense of moral obligation or ethical obligation. And that must be right. I think it's very few people would disagree with the notion that we have some sort of moral obligation to respect other people. At least I hope we would. But I want to try to tempt you into the legal territory, which you carefully avoided, understandably. And think about where the notion of respect in the legal context can be operationalized and how it could be operationalized. I'm skeptical for two reasons. Not that you are arguing that, I realize that, but to tempt you into that territory. One reason for skepticism, I think, is that it's very difficult to imagine an obligation for someone to respect another person. In other words, if I demand respect, I've sort of already lost the game. Yeah, you can't demand respect for somebody else. Respect has to be given on the basis of some sort of understanding that the other person is due that respect. Right? So it's an obligation rather than a right of any kind. At least that's how it strikes me. But the other reason for skepticism, I think, is the idea that you build a sort of polity on respect is that it encourages a kind of respect inflation. In other words, if the basis for someone having voice is respect, and if the complaint therefore is you're disrespecting me, then it encourages people to, if they want voice, to claim to be disrespected. And that seems a questionable way forward to create a situation in which you're encouraging, essentially, or creating an incentive, maybe is the better way to say it, for people to feel disrespected, if that's the basis on which they then get a priority or a particular position of voice. So can I tempt you into that area of what's the relationship between respect as a moral obligation on us in the legal context? Because the reason why I think parity of esteem is interesting in the constitutional or legal context is because it seems to bridge the moral and the legal.
Thank you. Tom has a question. So
He does have a question, but he's perfectly willing to give way.
there were no other hands. So
Oh,
you have a
great.
question.
Two points, one for Anurag, one for Simon, or more accurately, one for the conversation that has happened with Anurag and the conversation that has happened with Simon. On the issue of the UK and the metropole, and whether the metropole is Whitehall or London or England, I think what's interesting about the UK is that it's both, right? In that, yes, lines on maps during the period, the 1800 period of the Union with Ireland, yes, it was emphatically part of the metropole. That was the whole point of the Act of Union of 1800. But it's interesting, and I think Brendan O'Leary makes this point as well in his treatise on Northern Ireland, that there are differences in actual patterns of government rather than lines on maps. So the contrast between the Dublin Metropolitan Police being a P-light civilian unarmed force, as one would find in Birmingham or London, and the RIC as an armed paramilitary force, and the position of the Irish cabinet, the chief secretary and so forth, which I think tells us a little something about how it's neither fish nor fowl, and how where the metropole is depends not only on who you are and what your aspiration perspective is, but what you're talking about at the given moment. Because the metropole at any given moment might be the UK as a whole, it might be probably not England, it might be London, it might be Whitehall, Westminster, Buckingham Palace, where have you. So I think I think it's not as easy as one or the other. On the issue of parity of esteem, the meaning of respect, I was struck, I think I've said before, how Richard English yesterday said that it also means admiration as well. And you mentioned Micheál O'Sullivan, the ethnomusicologist, which brought back a kind of Madeleine childhood memory of my mother liking his music an awful lot. I mean, I wasn't familiar with the fact that he translates parity of esteem as Corrum Féine, which is interesting because that also brings with it kind of mythological baggage of the Fianna and so forth. Perhaps there's somebody far better qualified than me who can correct me, but the word Corrum, I mean, the root there is traum, which means heaviness or weight, and then the co prefix is co-equal heaviness or weight. So even the word Corrum contains within it already an idea of equality. But then if we're making that more than just equality, we're making it esteem, we have to add something else, which off the top of my head, I would have said massa, respect. I checked folklore.ie just as you were speaking and remembered the word omos, which is interesting because that can also mean honor, or something could be an homage to someone, in omos to someone. And there was also a word I had never heard before, urum. But I think even just as we try to translate concepts and transplant concepts across jurisdictions, it's when we try to do this with language also, we run into difficulties. What are we actually translating? What's the object? And this made me think of Brian Friel's translations and ideas of belonging, ethnic cleansing, jura, and so forth. So as you can see, my brain isn't actually quite working today. I'm spinning around in circles. But anyway, thank you to both the speakers.
Thank you for your questions. Anurag, do you want to start?
Yes, I agree. I think it's one of the reasons. I mean, originally when I did this presentation in Essex, what was it, 2 years ago? I didn't use the words centrifugal and centripetal. I used the words central and decentral. And one of the reasons I changed the terminology was because in my head there's multiple centers. When you look at the polities and when you look at the evolution of the communities in conflict, there are multiple centers. Some of them are contingent and some of them are permanent, but multiple centers in that narrative at the same time. And so I wanted a framework of relations rather than fixed points. But yeah, I mean, I think that's true because yeah, the governance of Ireland itself was different. It wasn't the same as England, and so we have to take that into consideration. And it'll give me some thought for how far back I take this in terms of the analogy, or in terms of the sort of Ireland, Northern Ireland component of the paper, how far back in time I take this. I might go all the way back to the start of the Union, or the institutions of the Union kept from the pre-Union times as a sort of a continuation of, you know, this is a place apart and this was a place apart then too. So yeah, thank you for that.
Before I get to Chris, just on what Tom said, I think it's very interesting. I was trying to prompt that discussion, and I did gloss over languages. I touched on it, but that would have been one of the other 20 points. But I can bore you with that at another occasion. But I'm saving for my last comments the rest of my little poem. And I chose a Filipino form because Filipino is an artificially constructed language to try to bridge the other languages in the Philippines. But there are other examples. Parity of Esteem actually explicitly mentioned in the South African Constitution in relation to languages and so on and so forth. And I, you know, like lawyers being wordsmiths, I'm fascinated by language generally. But you mentioned Brian Friel, so I just want to say that when I used to work here at Queen's, University Square, the switchboard stopped after a certain time. And when Robin and I were trying to get 200 patrons for Initiative 92, this is before mobile phones. You could fax people if you knew that or whatever. It's quite difficult to kind of just make it happen. And when the switchboard closed, it wasn't clear how people could get back in touch. But once I was staying, because I was teaching a course in the evening in medical law and ethics, and I got a phone call through, which is really odd, at about 6 o'clock, put through by the security porters, who in those days were there, but they now seem to be here. And the porter was really, and the fair employment dispute was telling us that all the porters were Protestant. And he said, "You'll never believe who's on the phone for you, Brian Friel." And he was so excited, and I walked across to the medical faculty, which he knew was why I was around. And he sort of intercepted me, and we became very friendly about it all after that. He really appreciated Brian Friel across, if you want to put it in that way, you know, across traditions, which was very moving and salutary. And I sort of, at the time, was trying to kind of, I mean, I wouldn't have said it at the time because it would have embarrassed him, but, you know, trying to kind of garner these particular stories of what and who people valued, you know? So Queen's at the time, I think, valued Bryce and Tom and Edna Longley and Edith Devlin, with whom I taught in extramural classes. All these people who were doing things in the community. By the time it got to the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, Queen's didn't seem very interested in what their own staff had done, but got fixated on the political scene. But all of those things are part of the experience and culture, I think, and ethos, if you want to put it in that way. And no doubt we can explore that further. Coming back to Chris. So I think yesterday people seemed to say you can tolerate something, you can respect something which is higher, and then you go to some level of admiration, something like that. And then the question of if you demand it, then you've kind of lost it in a sense, which is interesting. So Joseph Raz, colleague of Chris's and my tutor, he taught me constitutional law, administrative law, unbelievably European community law, as well as jurisprudence. The European community law paper had problem questions set by Bernard Rudden, who thought it was funny to set questions on, imagine you're skiing down a skim milk powder mountain and you fall over, can you sue various European community bodies? But we were being taught by Joe Raz to consider what the rule of recognition or the Grundnorm would be if the UK decided to leave what was then the European community, which we'd only just joined, which turned out to be more helpful in a way, rolling forward to 2016. But Joe, I think, says that you can't tolerate something if you couldn't care less about it in the first place. So it's only those of us who have prejudices against certain things, maybe a lifestyle or something, who get into the position of ever having the virtue of tolerating it. Because if you just couldn't care less, you just really stay laid back, then you're not tolerating it. Yeah. That was what he said anyway. And respect goes higher. And if you're going even higher, I find it very difficult to ask for, demand, or expect respect for myself. But my job has been sometimes to try to make it happen for the students and staff in the institutions which, to my mind, are underappreciated. And there, it's not, for instance, a legal requirement, but a councillor in Liverpool, the Liberal Democrat leader, Mike Story, who's now Lord Story, also unbelievably, he was extremely difficult as a governing body member, or good, if you like, in challenging. But he did a beautiful thing for us in arguing that when the freedom of the City of Liverpool was being conferred on the University of Liverpool and Liverpool John Moores, it should also be conferred on Liverpool Hope, much to the annoyance of Liverpool John Moores. The University of Liverpool was big enough to get over it. And that had a huge impact. And similarly, our students won a Queen's Anniversary Prize for their volunteering in Ladakh in northern India every summer to help Tibetan refugee children. So those are the kinds of things which, it didn't cost anybody anything, but it added enormously to the sense of pride. And then at Leeds Met, we won the first, I hate league tables. The only league table I like in universities is the only one which students can influence week on week, which is the sports league table, Bucks, in which we rose from 27th to 2nd. But you can't influence many of the others. But it's okay to win a prize. So we won a prize for outstanding contribution of the university and the community for our work with Bradford City Football Club and its Manningham, Bradford Muslim neighbours, for instance. But we also came first in the first People and Planet league table of greenness or sustainability, but only because nobody knew it was happening. They took public data and published a league table, and then everybody else started playing a game, and we plummeted. But in these kinds of ways, respect or legitimacy, something like that, but almost admiration for distinctiveness can be conferred. And I think that's what I'm interested in. But turning to something legal, I suppose one of the things which I did touch on, but glossed over, is that in the USSR, I became fascinated about how are the referendums going to work. And they had detailed rules when it broke up, but before it broke up, on how you had to be even-handed in arguing that it should leave, that a republic should leave, like Turkmenistan, or stay. And I was very interested, therefore, in the Scottish referendum in 2014. That I think that is a good example of the state accepting that you've got to let people argue the best possible case fairly, and you had an independent electoral commission that challenged the question that was set. The question was originally set as, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? And the electoral commission said, that is leading people towards the idea a decision has already been taken to leave. And so the question became, should Scotland be an independent country? To which the answer turned out to be no. Just, if you like. And I think those kinds of things at that top-down level, I think the state can be required to be rigorously impartial on something. Now, whether that's respect or not, I think it is. But if I can give an example in a university context, when I arrived at Leeds Met, we were in trouble with the Sunday Times because we had changed, I mean, it wasn't me because I wasn't there, but we'd changed our way of admitting students for physiotherapy. We had 40 students, it's like an NHS contract for physiotherapy. And apparently all 40 turned out to be female, white, and wanting to run on the pitch at Chelsea or Liverpool or Manchester City and whatever. Whereas the NHS wanted people to go into the home of a Muslim grandma in Bradford and help her after her stroke. So quite reasonably, my predecessors tried to sort out why is it not working? And in the end, they had an 8-part process, which began with, you had to have certain qualifications and certain experience and volunteer and so on and so forth. They got down from 1,600 applicants to 400, and then the last 40 was a randomized computer lottery program, and it produced people who were visually impaired and had all kinds of other disabilities. There were men and so on and so forth. It was a great success, and the media hated it and were slamming us. And they said that they didn't use the words parity of esteem, but they're saying, it's showing disrespect to white Yorkshire people. And they particularly disliked these words, which my predecessor had used, random and lottery. But he meant them in a positive sense. It's a randomized computer program that is like a lottery, like drawing lots, rather than whatever our bias was, working its way into the system. And I think in those kinds of ways, we were respecting all the applicants as best we could. I mean, again, it wasn't to my credit, but I was trying to defend it. And the arguments about those kinds of things, at that time then the Schwartz report came out and was talking about bias, and I think these things become very, very important to the student body and the staff, because even while they are understandably whinging about evil management doing all sorts of things, they can be proud that the institution tried to address something that was, to use that word, disrespectful, and to model what could be done in other walks of life within the university. Sorry, I've gone on to...
No, that's fine. We're 1 minute early, and I am not going to stand between you and lunch. So this session is closed. We're back at 2 for the final session. Thank you all for your attention and for your questions.
Thank you.